The rain poured down heavily against the massive glass windows of the penthouse apartment. Inside, Richard Whitmore sat alone in his leather chair, staring at nothing in particular. His eyes were red and tired, not from lack of sleep, but from crying when no one was watching. This man, who owned 3 companies and had more money than he could ever spend, felt completely helpless for the first time in his life, just 2 days ago. The doctors had delivered news that shattered his entire world. His 3-year-old triplets, Bella, Rose, and little Tommy, had a rare genetic condition. The medical team, after running countless tests and consulting specialists from around the globe, had given him the worst possible timeline. 1 week, they said. Maybe 10 days if the children were lucky. There was no cure, no experimental treatment, nothing that could save them. Richard had built his fortune from absolutely nothing. He grew up in a small apartment with a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. By the age of 30, he had created a tech company that changed how people communicated across the world. He was used to solving problems, fixing things, making impossible deals happen. But this was beyond anything money or intelligence could fix. His wife, Victoria, had left when the babies were only 6 months old. Taking care of 3 infants at once had been too much for her. She said she felt trapped, suffocated, like she was losing herself. One morning, Richard woke up to find a note on the kitchen counter and an empty closet. She was gone, moved to Paris with some artist she'd met at a gallery opening. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. Since then, Richard had tried his best. He really had. But running $1 billion empire while raising triplets alone proved nearly impossible. He hired nannies, lots of them. Professional women with impressive resumes, certifications from fancy institutions, years of experience with difficult children. But none of them lasted. The longest anyone stayed was 5 weeks. The children were challenging, there was no denying it. They cried constantly, especially at night. They refused to eat properly. They didn't smile or laugh like other kids their age. They seemed disconnected, like they were living behind an invisible wall that nobody could break through. Richard knew deep in his heart that part of the problem was him. He was barely present. After Victoria left, he threw himself into work, sometimes spending 16 hours a day in his office. It was easier to focus on board meetings and profit margins than to face 3 tiny faces that reminded him of his failed marriage and his inadequacy as a father. That rainy Tuesday morning, nanny number 18 was scheduled to arrive. Richard barely cared anymore. What was the point? In a week, maybe less, his children would be gone. The agency had called the previous evening, apologizing profusely. The certified nanny they'd promised had canceled at the last minute, something about a family emergency. Instead, they were sending someone else, a backup candidate who didn't have the usual qualifications, but came highly recommended by some of their clients. Richard had simply grunted his approval on the phone. Send whoever. It didn't matter. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 in the morning. Richard's assistant, Patricia, answered it while he remained in his study, pretending to read emails he couldn't focus on. He heard voices in the foyer, then footsteps approaching. "Mr. Whitmore, the new caregiver is here," Patricia announced from the doorway. Richard looked up and saw a young woman standing nervously behind Patricia. She was probably in her late 20s, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying an old canvas bag. Her hands looked rough, like she was used to hard work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held a warmth that was uncommon in the city. "I'm Maria Santos," she said with a slight accent, offering her hand. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Whitmore." Richard shook her hand briefly, barely making eye contact. "The children's wing is on the 3rd floor. Patricia will show you where everything is. They take their meals at specific times. The schedule is posted in the kitchen. The medical team comes twice daily to check vitals and administer medications. Keep the room temperature at exactly 72 degrees. Don't take them outside. Don't let them overexert themselves. Any questions?" Maria opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. "No, sir. I'll take good care of them." "Right," Richard muttered, already turning back to his computer. "Patricia, make sure she has everything she needs." As their footsteps faded down the hallway, Richard felt a familiar weight settle on his chest. Another stranger would come into his children's lives, stay for a few weeks until she couldn't handle it anymore, then disappear. Except this time, it truly didn't matter. In a week, everything would be over anyway. He tried to focus on the acquisition deal in front of him, but the numbers blurred together. His mind kept drifting to the medical reports, the grim faces of the doctors, the way little Tommy had looked at him yesterday with those big, confused eyes, as if asking why he felt so bad. An hour passed, maybe 2. The apartment was unusually quiet. Normally, by this time, Richard would hear crying from the children's wing, the sound of the nanny trying desperately to soothe them, footsteps pacing back and forth. But today, there was only silence. Curious despite himself, Richard left his study and walked toward the 3rd floor. As he climbed the stairs, he heard something unexpected. Singing, a soft, gentle voice singing a melody in Spanish. He didn't understand the words, but the tune was soothing, almost hypnotic. He reached the children's room and stopped at the doorway, unseen. What he saw made him freeze. Maria was sitting on the floor, which was already unusual. Every other nanny had insisted on maintaining professional boundaries, keeping the children in their cribs or designated play areas. But Maria sat cross-legged on the soft carpet, and in her lap was Bella, the smallest of the triplets. The little girl's head rested against Maria's chest, and for the first time in months, she looked peaceful. Rose sat beside them, playing with a soft doll, actually engaged with the toy rather than staring blankly at it. And Tommy, who usually cried whenever anyone tried to hold him, was in Maria's arms, his tiny hand clutching her finger, his eyes slowly closing as she sang. The medical equipment that usually beeped and hummed was still there. The tubes and monitors still connected, but somehow the whole scene felt different, less like a hospital room and more like a home. Richard must have made a sound because Maria's eyes lifted and met his. She didn't stop singing immediately, finishing the verse before gently placing her finger to her lips and nodding toward Tommy, who had fallen asleep. Carefully, moving with practiced ease, she laid the little boy in his crib, then did the same with Bella. Rose yawned and crawled to her own bed without being told, something she'd never done before. Maria stepped out of the room, quietly closing the door most of the way, leaving it cracked just enough to hear if they woke. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, "I hope I didn't overstep. The children seemed to need comfort more than routine." Richard found himself speechless. He'd just watched his 3 children, who the doctor said had days to live, look more content than they had in their entire short lives. "How did you—" he started, then stopped, unsure what he was even asking. Maria smiled gently. "I grew up in a small village. My grandmother raised 11 children, and I helped care for my younger siblings and cousins. I learned that babies, all children really, they understand love even when they don't understand words. They were scared, Mr. Whitmore, not just sick, but frightened and lonely." Something in Richard's chest cracked open. Frightened and lonely. That described his children perfectly. It also described him. For the next 3 days, Richard found himself drawn out of his study more and more. He watched from doorways and hallways as Maria transformed the sterile children's wing into something warmer. She brought in soft blankets from home, ones that smelled like lavender. She opened the curtains despite the rules about controlled lighting, letting natural sunlight stream in. She sang constantly, talked to the children as if they understood every word, told them stories about her village and her family. And the children responded. They still had their monitors and medications. They were still critically ill, but something was changing. They ate better when Maria fed them. They slept more peacefully. They even started making small sounds, not quite laughter yet, but close. On the 4th day, Richard made a decision that terrified him. He canceled his afternoon meetings, all of them. He walked up to the children's wing and knocked on the door frame. Maria looked up from where she was reading a picture book to Rose. "Mr. Whitmore?" "I thought," he said awkwardly, "maybe I could join you, if that's all right." The smile that spread across Maria's face was warm and encouraging. Of course, the children would love that. "Rose, look who's here to visit." Richard sat down stiffly on the edge of a chair, unsure what to do with his hands. He'd provided everything money could buy for his children, but he realized with shame that he'd barely held them in weeks. He'd been too afraid, too wrapped up in his grief about losing them to actually be with them while they were still here. Tommy crawled over to him, pulling himself up using Richard's pant leg. The little boy looked up at his father with those same big eyes, but this time they seemed less confused and more hopeful. "Pick him up," Maria encouraged gently. "He wants you." With trembling hands, Richard lifted his son. Tommy immediately snuggled against his chest, and Richard felt tears streaming down his face. This was his boy, his son, and he'd been so busy being terrified of losing him that he'd forgotten to love him. That evening, something remarkable happened. For the first time since the diagnosis, Richard ate dinner with his children. Maria had prepared simple food, nothing like the specialized nutrition plans the previous nannies had followed religiously. Just warm soup, soft bread, and mashed vegetables that actually smelled good. The children ate more than they had in days. As Richard watched Bella try to feed herself with a spoon, making a mess but smiling proudly, he realized that Maria hadn't just started caring for his children. She'd started teaching him how to be their father, and for the first time since hearing that devastating prognosis, Richard felt the smallest flicker of something he'd thought was gone forever. Hope. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Richard's penthouse. Dr. Helen Chen, the lead pediatric specialist who'd been overseeing the triplets' care, arrived unannounced with her medical team. Richard's heart sank when Patricia announced their arrival. He knew what this was about. Someone from the nursing staff must have reported the changes Maria had been making. The outdoor time, the visitors, all the protocol violations. Richard met them in the formal living room, preparing himself for a confrontation. Dr. Chen was a stern woman in her mid-50s, brilliant but rigid in her approach to medicine. She'd made it clear from the beginning that the triplets' survival depended on strict adherence to her treatment plan. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, settling into one of the leather chairs, her tablet already open with notes. "We need to discuss some concerning reports I've received about the children's care." "I can explain," Richard started, but Dr. Chen raised her hand. "Please, let me finish. My team has been reviewing the daily monitoring data from the past week, the vitals, the medication responses, the overall health markers." She paused, and Richard braced himself for the lecture. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't understand what's happening, but your children are improving." Richard blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Dr. Chen turned her tablet around, showing him a series of graphs and charts. "Look at these numbers. A week ago, we were seeing steady decline across all indicators. I told you to prepare for the worst because, frankly, I've seen this progression before and it never ends well. But starting 6 days ago, something changed. The decline stopped. Then, 3 days ago, we started seeing improvement. Small at first, but consistent. They're getting better?" Richard asked, afraid to hope. "Better is relative," Dr. Chen cautioned. "They're still critically ill. The genetic condition hasn't disappeared, but their bodies are responding differently, fighting harder. Their immune markers are stronger. Their neurological responses are more active. Even their appetite has improved significantly, which shouldn't be possible given their condition." One of the other doctors, a younger man Richard recognized as Dr. Patel, spoke up. "We've been comparing notes with cases from around the world. Nothing in the medical literature explains this kind of turnaround. Whatever you're doing differently, it's working." Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "It's not me. It's Maria, the new caregiver. She's been doing things differently, things that probably violated every instruction you gave me." "Like what?" Dr. Chen asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Richard explained everything. The outdoor time, the fresh food, the music and play, the visit from other children. He expected disapproval, maybe even anger. Instead, Dr. Chen sat back in her chair with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, something almost like wonder. "Psychoneuroimmunology," she said softly. "I'm sorry," Richard said. "It's a field of study that examines the connection between psychological processes and the nervous and immune systems," Dr. Chen explained. For years, it was dismissed as pseudoscience, But recent research has shown that emotional well-being, social connection, and environmental factors can have measurable impacts on physical health. I've read the studies, but I've never seen it work like this in practice. So you're not going to tell me to stop what Maria's been doing? Richard asked carefully. On the contrary, Dr. Chen said, closing her tablet. I'm going to recommend you continue exactly what you're doing. I want to meet this Maria and understand her approach better. We might need to adjust some parameters for safety, but if the children continue showing improvement, we'd be fools to interfere. After the medical team left, Richard found Maria in the children's room, singing softly while Bella played with colorful scarves. He shared the news about the doctor's visit, watching as Maria's eyes filled with tears of joy. I knew it, she whispered. I could feel them getting stronger. Their spirits were coming back to life. Dr. Chen wants to meet with you. Learn about what you've been doing, Richard said. Maria, you might have actually saved my children's lives. Maria shook her head gently. No, Mr. Whitmore, we saved them together. You opened your heart and started being their father again. That's what they needed most. Over the next few weeks, the transformation continued. Dr. Chen worked with Maria to create a modified care plan that balanced medical necessity with what Maria called soul care. The children spent time outside every day, weather permitting. Maria's nieces visited twice a week, bringing laughter and normal childhood chaos into the sterile penthouse. Richard changed, too. He restructured his entire work schedule, delegating responsibilities he'd once thought only he could handle. He started working from home 3 days a week. On those days, he'd join Maria and the children for activities, learning how to play, how to connect, how to be present. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Maria had first arrived, Richard was lying on the floor with Tommy building a tower of soft blocks. The little boy was concentrating intensely, his tongue sticking out slightly as he carefully placed each block. When the tower stood tall, almost as tall as Tommy himself, the boy looked at his father with pure pride. Dada, look, Tommy said clearly, his first real sentence. Richard grabbed his son and hugged him, tears flowing freely. I see it, buddy. You did such a good job. I'm so proud of you. Maria watched from across the room where she was helping the girls with a puzzle, her smile warm and knowing. This was what healing looked like, not just in bodies, but in relationships, in hearts that had been closed off by fear and pain, but not everything was perfect. There were still hard days, moments when the reality of the children's condition came crashing back. One night, Bella had a fever that spiked dangerously high. The medical team rushed over, and for 12 terrifying hours, it seemed like all the progress might unravel. Richard sat by Bella's bedside all night, holding her tiny hand, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Maria stayed too, cooling Bella's forehead with damp cloths, singing softly even when it seemed like the little girl couldn't hear. As dawn broke, the fever finally broke too. Bella's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at her father with recognition and love. Dada, she whispered, reaching for him. That morning, after the crisis had passed and Bella was sleeping peacefully, Richard found Maria in the kitchen making tea. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her spirit seemed unbroken. Thank you, Richard said simply, for staying, for not giving up on her. She's not just a job to me, Mr. Whitmore, Maria said, pouring hot water into 2 cups. None of them are. They've become part of my heart. Richard accepted the tea she offered him and sat down at the kitchen island. Maria, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you take this job? The agency said you didn't have formal certifications, that you were a last-minute replacement. But you're clearly gifted with children. You could work anywhere, probably for more money and certainly with less difficulty than 3 critically ill toddlers. Why here? Why us? Maria was quiet for a moment, stirring honey into her tea. My grandmother died 2 years ago. She was 93 years old and sharp as a knife until the very end. Before she passed, she told me something. She said that my gift wasn't just caring for children, it was healing broken families. She said I would know when I found the family that needed me most. She also started playing music, real music, not just the classical pieces the child development experts had recommended. She played salsa from her homeland, old folk songs, even some pop music that made the children's eyes light up. She danced with them, moving their little arms and legs in rhythm, making them laugh in a way that Richard had never heard before. But the biggest change came on the 6th day, when Maria approached Richard with a request that seemed absolutely insane. He was in his study, actually working this time when she knocked on the door. "Mr. Whitmore, may I speak with you about something important?" "Of course," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Is everything all right? Are the children okay?" "They're doing well, actually better than well," Maria said, sitting down and folding her hands in her lap. "But I believe they need something more, and I wanted to ask your permission before doing anything." Richard felt anxiety creep up his spine. "What is it?" "The children need to be around other children," Maria said simply. "They need to see kids their own age playing, laughing, being normal. They've been isolated for so long that they don't even know what childhood is supposed to look like." "Absolutely not," Richard said immediately. "Their immune systems can't handle exposure to other children. One common cold could kill them in their current state. The doctors have been very clear about this. I understand the risks," Maria said calmly. "That's why I'm not suggesting we take them to a daycare or playground. But what if we brought a few carefully selected children here? My sister has 2 daughters, ages 4 and 5. They're healthy, fully vaccinated, very gentle kids. What if they came for just an hour or 2, played with your children in a controlled environment?" "That's still too dangerous," Richard argued. But even as he said it, he thought about what Maria had told him about souls and bodies being connected. What good was keeping his children alive if they never got to experience real life? "Mr. Whitmore," Maria said, leaning forward, her eyes intense with conviction, "your children have 1 week to live, maybe 2. That's what the doctors said. We're now on day 6, and they're not getting worse. They're getting better, not dramatically, not in a way that suggests they're cured, but better nonetheless. Don't you think they deserve to spend whatever time they have left experiencing joy? Real, genuine, childish joy?" Richard felt tears burning behind his eyes. She was asking him to risk the thing he feared most, exposing his vulnerable children to potential harm. But she was also asking him to give them the thing they needed most, a taste of normal life, of childhood, of connection. "If anything happens to them because of this," he started. "Then it will be my responsibility," Maria interrupted. "I will take full blame. But Mr. Whitmore, I truly believe in my heart that this isolation is hurting them more than helping them. They need to see that life is worth fighting for." Richard thought about it for a long time, his mind racing through all the possible disasters. But then he remembered Bella's face when she saw that butterfly, Tommy's wonder at the clouds, Rose trying to say Dada. He remembered what it felt like to be alive, really alive, not just existing in fear. "1 hour," he finally said. "Your nieces can come for 1 hour. They must be checked by our medical team first. Any sign of illness, even a sniffle, and the visit is canceled. And I want to be there the entire time." Maria's face lit up with a smile so bright it could have powered the whole building. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. You won't regret this." 2 days later, on a sunny Saturday morning, Maria's sister arrived with her 2 daughters, Lucia and Carmen. The girls had been thoroughly checked by Richard's medical team, declared perfectly healthy, and given strict instructions about gentle play and hand washing. Richard stood nervously by the window, watching as Maria introduced the girls to the triplets. At first, his children just stared, uncertain about these new small humans in their space. But Lucia, the older girl, sat down and started building blocks, and Rose crawled over, fascinated. Carmen began singing a silly song, and Tommy actually smiled, a real, genuine smile. Within 20 minutes, all 5 children were playing together. It wasn't wild or chaotic, just simple, beautiful play. Bella knocked over a tower of blocks and everyone laughed. Tommy tried to stack cups and the other children cheered when he succeeded. Rose shared her favorite doll with Lucia. Richard watched through tears he didn't bother to hide. This was what Maria had been trying to tell him. His children weren't just bodies that needed medicine. They were souls that needed connection, love, and life. The hour passed too quickly, But when Maria's sister gathered her daughters to leave, Richard saw something miraculous. His children were exhausted, yes, but it was a good exhaustion. The kind that comes from actually living, not from being sick. That night, all three children slept more peacefully than they had in months, and Richard, sitting in a chair between their cribs, realized that Maria hadn't just come into their lives to care for his children. She'd come to teach all of them how to truly live, however much time they had left. The next morning arrived with an unusual quiet. Richard woke up and immediately noticed something was different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it at first, but then he realized what it was. There was no singing coming from the children's wing, no soft Spanish lullabies, no gentle humming, none of the sounds that had become the soundtrack of their mornings over the past 2 months. He quickly got dressed and headed toward the 3rd floor, his heart racing with worry. When he reached the children's room, he found them awake and playing quietly with their toys, but Maria was nowhere to be seen. Patricia, his assistant, was sitting in the corner chair looking uncomfortable and out of place. "Where's Maria?" Richard asked, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "She asked me to watch the children for a few hours," Patricia explained. "She said she had some personal business to take care of. Don't worry, Mr. Whitmore. She showed me everything I need to do. The children have been very good." Richard nodded, but his mind was racing. Personal business? In the 2 months Maria had been with them, she'd never once asked for personal time. She'd been there every single day, completely dedicated to the children. The timing of this, right after their conversation last night about her possibly leaving, made his stomach twist with anxiety. He spent the morning trying to work, but couldn't focus on anything. Every few minutes he'd check his phone, hoping for a message from Maria. Nothing came. He went to check on the children multiple times, finding them content, but clearly missing Maria. Tommy kept looking toward the door, waiting for her to appear. Rose seemed quieter than usual. Even Bella, usually the most energetic, seemed subdued. By lunchtime, Richard couldn't take it anymore. He called the employment agency that had sent Maria to him. After being transferred 3 times, he finally got someone who could help. "I'm calling about Maria Santos," Richard said. "She's been working for me for the past 2 months, and I need to know about her employment status." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm looking at our records now. Maria Santos was only contracted to work for you for 8 weeks. That contract ended yesterday, actually. She fulfilled her obligation completely. 8 weeks?" Richard repeated, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under him. "But she never said anything about a contract ending." "Well, it's all standard, sir. Most placements start with a trial period. If everything works out, we can certainly arrange an extension or a new contract. Would you like me to set that up?" "Yes," Richard said immediately. "Yes, please." "Whatever it takes. She can't leave." "I'll send over the paperwork this afternoon," the woman on the phone said cheerfully, completely unaware of the crisis happening on Richard's end. "Though I should mention, we'll need Maria's agreement as well. She's free to decline the extension if she chooses." That last sentence hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Of course she was free to decline. She was free to walk away, to go help another family, to move on with her life. He'd been so focused on his own needs, on what his children needed, that he hadn't really considered what Maria might want for herself. When Maria finally returned late that afternoon, Richard was waiting in the main living room. He heard the front door open and practically jumped up from his chair. She looked surprised to see him there. "Mr. Whitmore, I didn't expect you to be home. I hope Patricia managed okay with the children." "Where were you?" Richard asked, the words coming out more accusatory than he'd intended. Maria set down her bag, her expression becoming guarded. "I told Patricia I had personal business. I'm sorry if my absence caused any problems. Were you looking at other jobs?" Richard asked bluntly. "Is that what this was about?" Maria's eyes widened slightly. "No, actually. I was visiting my grandmother's grave. Today is the anniversary of her death. I go every year to bring flowers and talk to her, tell her about my life, about the families I've helped." Richard felt shame wash over him. Here he'd been, working himself into a panic, making it all about him, while Maria was honoring someone she'd clearly loved deeply. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. It's all right. Maria said, but her voice was tired. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to talk about something important." They sat down, and Maria folded her hands in her lap. That same gesture she'd made the very first time they'd had a serious conversation. "I found out today that my contract ended yesterday," Richard said before she could speak. "The agency told me it was an 8-week trial placement." "You never mentioned that." "I didn't think it mattered," Maria said softly. "I was here to do a job, to help your children. The length of the contract didn't change my commitment to them." "The agency can draw up a new contract," Richard said quickly. "Whatever you want, better pay, more time off, anything. Just please don't leave." Maria looked at him with those deep, understanding eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, it's not about money or benefits. It's about what's right for everyone involved. What's right is you staying here with children who love you," Richard insisted. "But is it right for me?" Maria asked gently. "I've spent my whole adult life going from family to family, helping during their hardest times, then moving on. I told you about my grandmother's words about healing broken families. But what about my own life? My own family someday?" Richard felt his heart sink. Of course she wanted her own life, her own family. She was a young woman with her whole future ahead of her. How selfish had he been to think she'd want to stay indefinitely, caring for someone else's children? "I understand," he said, though the words felt like they were tearing out of his chest. "If you need to move on, I won't stand in your way. But can you at least stay until we find someone else? For the children's sake, so the transition isn't too sudden." Maria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying his face. "Can I ask you something honestly, Mr. Whitmore?" "Anything." "Why do you really want me to stay? Is it just for the children, or is there another reason?" Richard opened his mouth to give the safe answer, the professional answer about her exceptional skills and the children's attachment to her. But something in Maria's expression, a vulnerability he'd never seen before, made him want to be truthful. "At first, yes, it was just about the children," he admitted. "You saved their lives in ways I'll never be able to repay. But over these past 2 months, you've become so much more than their caregiver. You've taught me how to be a better father, a better person. You've brought life and warmth into this cold, sterile apartment. You've made us a family." He paused, gathering courage for what he needed to say next. "And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as an employee. I started seeing you as someone I care about deeply, someone I look forward to seeing every morning, someone whose opinion matters to me more than anyone else's. I'm not saying this to make you uncomfortable or to pressure you. I just think you deserve honesty." Maria's eyes glistened with tears. "Mr. Whitmore—" "Richard," he interrupted gently. "Please just call me Richard." "Richard," she said, and hearing his name in her voice made his heart skip. "I care about you too. About all of you. More than I should, probably. That's why I've been struggling with this decision. It would be so easy to stay, to keep being part of this family. But I'm scared. Scared of what?" "And you think we're that family?" Richard asked softly. "I knew it the moment I walked through your door," Maria said, meeting his eyes. "I saw 3 babies who were dying not just from illness but from loneliness. And I saw a father who was dying inside from grief and fear. I couldn't save my grandmother, but I thought maybe I could help save you all." Richard felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Over the past weeks, he'd come to depend on Maria in ways that went beyond her role as a caregiver. She'd become his guide, his teacher, helping him rediscover how to be human again. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he said. "You already have," Maria replied. "By choosing to show up for your children every day, by being willing to change and grow, by trusting me even when it scared you. That's all the thanks I need." As the weeks turned into a month, then 2 months, the impossible continued to happen. The children who'd been given a week to live were not only surviving but thriving in ways that baffled the medical community. Dr. Chen brought in colleagues to study the case, and Richard's home became a sort of laboratory for understanding how emotional and social factors could impact serious illness. But beyond the medical marvel, something even more important was happening. Richard was becoming the father he'd always wanted to be but had been too afraid and too busy to become. He learned the children's favorite songs, their different cries, their unique personalities that were finally emerging. Rose, he discovered, was bold and adventurous, always trying to climb things and explore. Tommy was gentle and thoughtful, preferring quiet activities and close cuddles. Bella was the social one, always wanting to be where the action was, laughing the loudest at Maria's silly jokes. One evening, after the children were asleep, Richard and Maria sat on the balcony where this journey had really begun. The city lights twinkled below them, and the air was soft and warm. "Dr. Chen told me today that she's cautiously optimistic," Richard said. "She's never used those words before. It was always terminal and prepare for the worst, but today she said cautiously optimistic." "That's wonderful," Maria said, though her smile seemed somehow sad. "What's wrong?" Richard asked, noticing her expression. Maria sighed. "I've been thinking about something. The children are doing so much better now. You've learned how to care for them, how to be present with them. You don't really need me anymore." Richard felt panic rise in his chest. "What are you talking about? Of course we need you. The children adore you. You're part of this family? Am I?" Maria asked gently. "Or am I an employee who's done her job well? Mr. Whitmore, I came here to help a family in crisis. But the crisis is passing. You're not the broken, distant father you were 2 months ago. The children aren't those sad, disconnected babies. You're all healing, which means maybe it's time for me to go help another family that needs me." "No," Richard said firmly. "You can't leave." "I won't let you." Maria looked at him with those warm, knowing eyes. "It's not about what you'll let me do, Mr. Whitmore. It's about what's right." "What's right is you staying here," Richard insisted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Those children need you. I need you." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Richard had intended. He realized in that moment that his feelings for Maria had grown into something deeper than gratitude or professional appreciation. She'd become essential to his life, to his family, to his heart. But before he could say anything else, before he could examine these feelings too closely, Rose's cry came from inside. Not a distress cry, just a normal toddler waking up and wanting attention. "I should go to her," Maria said. "Standing up." "Maria, wait," Richard called. But she was already gone. As he sat alone on the balcony, Richard realized that saving his children's lives had only been the beginning. Now he faced an even more complicated challenge, figuring out what Maria truly meant to his family and finding the courage to ask her to stay, not as an employee, but as something more. "Scared of being the employee who falls for her employer," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of the power imbalance, of people thinking I'm taking advantage, of not knowing if what we feel is real or just gratitude and circumstance mixed together." Richard moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Maria, what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or circumstance. You're the strongest, kindest, most genuine person I've ever met. You see the good in people, in situations, even when everything seems hopeless. You brought my children back from the edge of death, and you brought me back from a darkness I didn't even realize I was in." "But what happens when the crisis is over?" Maria asked. "When the children are fully healthy and life goes back to normal? Will you still feel the same way about the woman who used to be your employee?" "You were never just an employee," Richard said firmly. "From the first day you were so much more. And the children aren't fully healthy yet. Dr. Chen says they're improving, but they still need careful monitoring, special care. They still need you. We all do." Before Maria could respond, they heard small footsteps padding down the hallway. Tommy appeared in the doorway, dragging his favorite blanket, his eyes still heavy with sleep from his afternoon nap. "Maria," he called out, his voice small and hopeful. Maria immediately went to him, scooping him up in her arms. "I'm here, sweet boy." "I'm right here." Tommy wrapped his arms around her neck and sighed contentedly. "Stay," he said simply. "Please stay." Richard watched them, his heart full to bursting. This little boy, who'd been given days to live just 2 months ago, was now walking, talking, expressing his needs and feelings. And he was asking for the same thing his father wanted, for Maria to stay. Over the next few days, something shifted in the household. Maria agreed to stay on, at least temporarily, while they figured things out. But the nature of her presence had changed. She was no longer just the caregiver. She joined the family for dinner every evening. She and Richard talked late into the night after the children were asleep, sharing stories about their lives, their dreams. their fears. Richard learned about Maria's childhood in a small village, about how she'd helped raise her younger siblings after her father died, about her grandmother who'd been the wisest person she'd ever known. Maria learned about Richard's struggles growing up poor, about his drive to succeed, about the loneliness that had haunted him even after he'd achieved everything he thought he wanted. 3 months after Maria had first walked through his door, Richard received a call from Dr. Chen that changed everything. "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to bring the children in for a comprehensive evaluation," she said. "The improvements we've been seeing, I want to run a full battery of tests." The tests took most of the day. Richard and Maria sat together in the waiting room, hands clasped tightly, both terrified and hopeful. Finally, Dr. Chen called them into her office. "I've been a pediatric specialist for 30 years, Dr. Chen began, her voice filled with emotion that Richard had never heard from her before. "I've seen thousands of cases, studied every medical journal, attended every conference, and I have never ever seen anything like this." "What does that mean?" Richard asked, afraid to breathe. "The genetic markers for the condition are still present in all 3 children," Dr. Chen explained. "That hasn't changed, but their bodies have somehow learned to compensate. The disease is still there, but it's no longer progressing. It's like their systems have found a way to work around it, to function despite it." "So they're going to be okay?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. "They're going to need ongoing monitoring," Dr. Chen said carefully. "They may always be more fragile than other children. But the death sentence I gave them 3 months ago, that's off the table. These children are going to live. They're going to grow up. They're going to have lives." Richard and Maria clung to each other, both crying openly. The children they'd been told to prepare to bury were going to live. They were going to have birthdays and first days of school and graduations and all the normal milestones that had seemed impossible. That night, after celebrating with a special dinner and tucking 3 very sleepy, very happy children into bed, Richard found Maria on their balcony, the place where so much of their journey had unfolded. "I was thinking," he said, joining her at the railing, "about what you said that first week, about souls and bodies being connected, about needing reasons to live." "I remember," Maria said softly. "You gave my children a reason to live," Richard continued. "You gave them love and joy and connection. But you gave me something too. You gave me a reason to be better, to show up, to be present. You didn't just save my children's lives, you saved mine too." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Maria Santos, I know this is complicated. I know people might talk, might question the timing or the circumstances. But I don't care. I love you. Not as an employer or out of gratitude, but as a man who's found the person who makes him want to be his best self." Maria's tears flowed freely now. "I love you too. I have for a while, but I was too scared to admit it." "Don't be scared," Richard said, wiping away her tears. "We've already survived the impossible. We can handle anything else that comes our way." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a promise of all the tomorrows they'd have together. 6 months later, Richard stood in a small church in Maria's village, surrounded by her extended family and a few close friends. The Triplets were there too, dressed in their finest clothes, serving as ring-bearers and flower girl. They'd grown so much, were so healthy and vibrant, that visitors who'd heard their story could barely believe it. As Maria walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, Richard felt gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for second chances, for the woman who'd seen past his walls, for children who'd defied every medical prediction, for love that had grown in the most unexpected circumstances. The priest spoke about miracles, about faith, about the mysterious ways that healing comes into our lives. But Richard knew the truth. The miracle wasn't just medicine or luck or divine intervention. The miracle was love, pure and simple. Love that showed up every day. Love that saw beyond symptoms to souls. Love that refused to give up, even when hope seemed lost. Years later, Richard would establish a foundation in Maria's grandmother's name, dedicated to holistic care for critically ill children. The program would combine cutting-edge medicine with emotional support, family counseling, and what Maria called soul care. Dr. Chen would serve on the board, Having become a passionate advocate for treating the whole child, not just the disease, the triplets would grow up healthy and strong, with only occasional medical checkups reminding them of how fragile their start in life had been. They would call Maria Mama and Richard Dad, and eventually, they'd have two younger siblings who never knew a world without both parents present and loving, but on that wedding day, none of that had happened yet. On that day, Richard and Maria simply stood together, hands clasped, hearts full, promising to face whatever came next as a family. The children who'd had 1 week to live were dancing at their father's wedding. The maid who'd arrived as a last-minute replacement had become the heart of a home, and the man who'd thought his world was ending had discovered that sometimes, when everything falls apart, it's actually making room for something better to begin. Sometimes the people who come into our lives to save us end up being the ones we were meant to find all along. The miracle wasn't that the children survived. The miracle was that they all learned how to truly live.